So good afternoon, everyone. We're going to officially start today's webinar. Welcome to World Oregon and the Technology Association of Oregon partnering for this webinar. We have a special guest zooming in, and I'll get to the program description in just a moment. Just a couple words for those of you who may not have been on a World Oregon webinar before or not for a while. As most Zoom webinars are, guests' video and audio is muted. And the only one with video and audio on is our speaker and World Oregon staff. You are encouraged to submit questions in the Q&A function of Zoom, which might be a different place on your computer depending on which setup you have, but on mine is at the bottom. You also can look in chat. We will post messages from time to time, or maybe links to reports or websites, and you can copy those or click on them to open up in your browser. After my presentation, my short presentation, our speaker will give his, and then our program director, Tim DeRoche, will moderate questions from the audience. So feel free to post your questions whenever you have them. As a reminder, participation in these webinars is free for members of World Oregon, and also for today's special program, members of the Technology Association of Oregon, with whom we partner from time to time on different events related to tech. This recording is taking place of this program to be posted on YouTube later. So just to mind your P's and Q's, and without any further ado, I'm going to jump right into the program. We are honored today to have Welton Chang present today on tech, tyranny, and the future of human rights. We happen to be graduates of the same college, and in fact, I learned about him and his really interesting work in an article about him in Alumni magazine, and it really caught our eye, and we're thrilled to have him join us today. So I'm just going to read a short bio about our speaker, and then I'm going to hand the floor over to Welton, who's going to give his presentation. He has some slides he'll be sharing, and then we'll have a robust Q&A. So Dr. Welton Chang is the Chief Technology Officer at the nonprofit Human Rights First. Prior to joining Human Rights First, he was a senior researcher at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, where he led teams and developed technical solutions to address disinformation and online propaganda. Before joining that organization, he served for nearly a decade as an intelligence officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency and in the Army, including 2 operational tours in Iraq and a tour in South Korea. He has a PhD and a master's from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's from Georgetown, and a bachelor's from Dartmouth College. He's a very knowledgeable and experienced man, and I think it should be a very interesting discussion. Without further ado, our main speaker for the day.
Thanks, Derek. And I want to thank World Oregon and the Technology Association of Oregon, Skip and Tim, for setting this up. And it's my distinct honor to be able to present this presentation to you today. I'm going to be talking about the future of human rights, specifically as it pertains to the way that technology is shaping our world, and to give you all some grist for the mill to have a robust debate at the end of this, because I think this is a very, very wide topic that people have significant disagreements about, and I want to set the stage so that we can have an informed debate and discussion about some of these topics. My presentation is structured in 3 parts. First, I'm going to be speaking about how we got from a moment in time when the internet did not exist to the moment in time today where we see tech pervading literally every part of our lives, and that there are several companies that are responsible for a lot of that pervasiveness. The second part, I'm going to dive into what that means as far as authoritarian regimes around the world using technology to go after the population, dissidents, and control people in a way that many experts now see as degrading human rights and degrading democracy and the way in which our livelihoods have been inexorably changed by the technology around us. And I'll be wrapping up with a short discussion about what can we do about this, and what are the ways in which we as citizens can mobilize through civil society with each other to hold governments and technology companies accountable for the changes that we're seeing in our lives that may ultimately lead to a world that we don't necessarily want to live in and or leave to our children. So I'm going to start off the presentation by talking a little bit about J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the director of Los Alamos Labs during the Manhattan Project, which was the big secret effort in the United States to develop a nuclear weapon that essentially ended the Second World War. And Oppenheimer has become the poster child for a scientist who wants other scientists and wants inventors and engineers and technologists to think harder about the morality of their actions and the morality of the technology that they've developed. And I think that Oppenheimer's, subsequent realization of his participation in the Manhattan Project and where that could potentially lead in terms of destructiveness in the technology pushed him to advocate for more stringent controls, international control, non-proliferation technology, civilian control technology, later on in his life. And I think that the key here is technologists, engineers, developers, oftentimes the first thing they think about is, can I do this? When one of the things they should be asking themselves in a sort of Hippocratic oath, if you want to use a medical analogy, is, should I do this? And what are some of the potential harms that could come as a result of me developing this specific technology? This slide has three individuals on it who I think if you were to ask any single individual whether or not they agreed with everything that they said, you probably wouldn't find too many folks who would find congruity across these three individuals. So Martin Luther on the left, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the middle, and President Trump on the right. And I put the three individuals here to illustrate a point in that they each found a way to use communication technology to subvert the powered structures of their day in some unique way. Martin Luther with the Gutenberg printing press, leveraging the ability to widely distribute the 95 Theses and other writings that directly spurred the Protestant Reformation. FDR using radio to directly communicate with the American population through his very famous fireside chats was his way of circumventing the existing gatekeepers of information and news at the time, which were the big corporate news outlets. And everyone knows President Donald Trump's use of Twitter and Facebook and social media to directly communicate with his audience, with his supporters, and with basically everyone in the world about what he's been thinking. And the big key here is the similar strain of communication technology, but that technology itself doesn't have any inherent morality or ideology to it. And that really it's about who's using it, how they're using it, and why they're using it. That's what's the key to understanding, where this could all potentially lead. In terms of, who's driving these changes and the way that, the internet evolved over time, and specifically information technologies. I'm not singling these three companies out for any specific reason, but I think it's instructive to look at their historic mission statements and how rooted they are in the techno-utopian value structure that early internet folks really thought were going to take hold and you enable people around the world to use the internet to fight for freedom, to subvert power structures, right? this idea that the internet would be this great flattener. And Amazon's original mission statement, basically to be the one place where you can buy essentially anything. Facebook wanting to connect anyone, anywhere to each other. Google wanting to organize the world's information. Those are in some ways, kind of morally neutral statements. However, the implications of the development of this technology has led to externalities that were very much unintended and not foreseen by the companies themselves, nor by the techno-utopians who were starting to, seed the internet with their value structures back in the late 80s and early 90s, back when I was first, starting out and building my first websites and, trolling around on AOL, for example. And on the right-hand side of the slide, there's a couple of images that I want to draw your attention to. Amazon, being able to buy anything that you want. Well, that also means being able to buy conspiracy-related paraphernalia, in this case with QAnon. Facebook connecting people anywhere to anyone else. The Tech Transparency Project did a research project where they looked at the number of cases that the Department of Justice, put on their website where children were exploited and, harmed by connections made on Facebook. And there were 336 of those cases, only 9% of which were actually reported by Facebook itself. And Google's very famous search suggestions, I think what you can see here is, yes, it's organizing the world's information, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the information is truthful. And oftentimes, we are actually surfacing information that is not truthful. Actually, I think that someone on the New York Times recently reported that if you searched 2020 election results, one of the first links that comes up in Google search is a link to Donald Trump winning the election, which didn't happen. Finally, I'll close this section by just talking very quickly about the intersection of technology and government, in that the size of the companies that we were talking about, the size and the scale of technologies that we're talking about, whether it's facial recognition or some of the digital surveillance technologies, which I'll touch on quite a bit in the second part, the scale of this is unprecedented. And in many ways, I'm making an argument that this time is different. And that's a very, very strong claim. And I'm going to try to back that up with some strong evidence. If you think about the responsibilities of government and what were previously actions that were only capable of governments to take, recent decisions by Apple, including their decision to encrypt all data on iPhones, that's a directly impacts the Fourth Amendment and protection against illegal search and seizure, for example. Twitter and Facebook as de facto public squares, that's got direct implications with our exercise of First Amendment rights. Amazon's decision not to collect sales tax early on, which led to their ability to dominate a lot of the online marketplaces, that's a direct challenge to the Commerce Clause, for example. And these companies, and I'm not trying to say that they haven't done enormous good. They certainly have done enormous good. But the way that they're structured from a corporate governance standpoint, untraditional, unique share structures that essentially prevent traditional corporate governance from working, means that the accountability processes, levers that we typically would pull to get government to change does not really work with tech companies, right? We have the vote, we have the ability to petition the government to change. If you don't like Facebook Oversight Board's decision, can you petition them to a point where they have to comply with a legal process? I don't think so, and I don't think they ever intended it for that to be the case. Even more worrisome is when these large companies are influenced or owned by state outright, and that state is an authoritarian one. At least here in the US, we have the ability to influence our government via democratic processes, and via those democratic processes, we can get legislation, regulations to influence the way that the tech companies operate. But what happens when we're talking about a China, a Russia, Saudi Arabia, or an Iran, countries where there isn't that democratic accountability, and there are tech companies that are growing up there and technology is being used? Foreign Affairs magazine back in 2019 asked about 60 or so experts on technology and democracy and human rights and other topics this question. They asked whether they agreed, and to what extent they agreed with the statement, technological change today is strengthening authoritarianism relative to democracy. And I think what you can see, given the way that the bubbles are laid out here, is that there is significant level of agreement with the statement, and that the scholars that were asked were highly confident in their prediction, in their agreement, that authoritarianism was essentially winning out over democracy as a result of the tech change that we're seeing. Now, what are some of those trends that are extremely worrying as it relates to authoritarianism and tech? I think the first thing to take note of is convergence. And in this case, convergence between the physical and virtual. And one of the things that I like to use as an example here is Bitcoin. And Bitcoin being a currency, a store of value that some use now to make purchases, that doesn't have any physical analog at all. And that what was previously the coins, the dollar bills that you carry around your wallet are now entirely ephemeral virtual assets. Now, the challenge here is that, yes, as a result of this convergence, we're seeing more and more physical things become entirely virtual, but those digital things virtual things can be tracked. And there's some evidence that there are mechanisms out there for even tracking, Bitcoin wallets and tracking blockchain and who's using that. The second trend I'll point to is the usurpation of public space by private actors. In this case, I'm talking about, thinking beyond the usurpation of, say, government responsibilities by private actors, and thinking more about how do private actors monetize some of those private spaces. Google Street View is an example. Street View is not allowed in Germany because the German government and the German people said, we don't necessarily want Google to be able to use public pictures in order to drive their mapping products and drive profit in the country. Similarly, Pokemon Go, which was an augmented reality game that was very popular for a couple of years, you could find Pokemon anywhere in the world, including private restaurants, people's homes, and people were just walking into these places looking for Pokemon to capture. And we talked a little bit about the tech and government overlap, but what happens when the technology disproportionately harms minorities and the poor? What are the levers that we can pull to get, for example, AI ethics, AI bias, and some of those considerations and principles built back into the technology that's currently owned by private companies? The way that these technologies are proliferating is also problematic, in that essentially the diffusion of this capability across time and space makes it so that a lot of people can do things that were previously the provenance of like a very, very highly empowered company. In many ways, that's great for, say, human rights activists, for organizations like ourselves at HRF, where we are trying to think about ways to build tech to empower human rights activists and defenders around the world and defend them. And we can do this cheaply. But the problem with this is that as these technologies proliferate and become more commonplace, yes, Davids can oftentimes get a running head start, but the Goliaths, the authoritarian regimes that we're talking about, especially ones that are tech-enabled, that have state-run enterprises that work in close collaboration with them, they're able to essentially outcompete in the long run the Davids that exist in the space. And that's something that we're seeing, in terms of what's happening in places like Belarus, Russia, Egypt, where human rights defenders are coming up against, widespread digital surveillance regimes that are making it much more difficult for them to do their work. So what's the authoritarian playbook with technology and with the people? I point to control and monopolistic control at that of the information that the population is seeing, the population themselves via widespread digital surveillance technologies. And finally, I'll point to the leadership level of activists, leaders, human rights defenders that we often work with at Human Rights First. And they're being targeted by governments enabled by technologies, sometimes supported by private tech companies, in order to ensure that no change is possible, that the people who are seeking greater rights, greater freedoms are not able to actually do their work. Controlling the information. Why is this possible? And how has, I think Peter Singer has written about this in the book Like War, human attention as a battlefield. Well, we've got here because of where we are putting our time and efforts are on a daily basis. I saw a tweet the other day that was pretty funny. It was somebody tweeting on a Sunday saying that another Sunday spent staring at the big screen, presumably watching football, scrolling through my little screen, their mobile device, as a reward for staring at my mid-sized screen all week long. And that's essentially how we're living our lives now, being mediated by screens. And it's become something that's even more egregious as a result of the pandemic, where we can't actually interact with people in real life anymore. And Mary Meeker's State of the Internet presentation, which she gives annually, it just drives it home, right? The Pew research on this. Most American adults spend over 8 hours a day staring at some kind of screen. And that's, more time than they spend sleeping. And so if everyone is tied in, hooked into this information technology, and a government can control exactly what you see on a regular basis, then it's no surprise that, you're not going to get the coupling, the tight coupling of democracy and economic development that many political scientists thought was going to be the rule of the day essentially in China, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about China here in a second. What are authoritarian regimes doing with disinformation? This problem is something that became much more in the public consciousness in 2016 after the revelations around the Russian Internet Agency and their activities influencing US voters during the 2016 election. And I think the Orwell quote here is pretty powerful. Power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing. And there's a whole industrial complex around disinformation now. It's not just state-sponsored, which is what I focused my research efforts on when I was at Johns Hopkins. It's also an entire industry. And there are organizations like the Global Disinformation Index that are charting just how much ad revenue disinformation purveyors are getting from people coming and looking at the information. So it's a self-perpetuating loop in that these organizations are able to fund their efforts and put even more disinformation in front of people, some of which is was originated by government actors, for example, from Sputnik or Russia Today. And it's not just the disinformation that's a problem, it's also the technology that's underlying how people experience the internet. And in the case of Belarus, when the protests there first kicked off, you saw the Belarusian government turn off the internet and prevent lots of information about what was going on there on the ground from reaching outside audiences. And the activists on the ground, what they essentially had to do was to find ways to circumvent those internet filters. And some of them wound up, taking video and trying to send it over Telegram, which has some, surveillance evasion capability built into it, in order to get that video to Poland, and eventually out to and Romania and out to the rest of the world. And the real strong players in this is China and the very famous Great Firewall, and what passes as access to the internet in a Chinese audience, and their ability to control essentially major parts of what the people in China see on a daily basis and are able to access about the outside world. In terms of digital surveillance and controlling the population, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about facial recognition, but I will just point out that in terms of monitoring large parts of a city or a state or even a whole country, we're talking about tech that has made it so much more efficient and cheaper to do this, and is always on and doesn't need sleep and doesn't need to be fed and doesn't need any encouragement from humans in order to do their work, right? Compare facial recognition technology via internet or cameras to the Stasi in East Germany operating in 1986. And the scale of the informant network in East Germany and the number of people that were part of the East German intelligence services in order to keep tabs on all those people. And you can replace that entire apparatus, that infrastructure, with just the hardware and the software that a lot of people have access to today and that can get implemented and networked together in such a way that it makes it virtually impossible for an activist, say in Hong Kong, to go from point A to point B without being instantly recognized by an artificial intelligence algorithm. And it's not just facial recognition, it's things like algorithmic fraud detection, right? So Alibaba and Ant Financial, they have a platform called Alipay. You may know about it. Alipay is one of the most widely used payment services in the world. They've got over 1 billion users, like much more users than, say, PayPal, for example. And the researchers at Alipay have one of the most accurate fraud detection algorithms ever created. Well, what else can you do with fraud detection algorithms? You can deny certain people access to the payment platform that is the ubiquitous platform for being able to operate in an economy. And you can eventually say, well, I just want these entire class of undesirable people from being able to access this payment structure entirely. And now you've excluded an entire potentially ethnic group or class of citizens, say human rights activists, from being able to touch something that is essential to their daily work. Now, and what is this? How does this manifest as a whole system? The Uyghur camps in China, I think, are just an encapsulation of how we can stitch all of these technologies together to create essentially a 1984-esque situation for an entire ethnic group of people. And the checkpoint system that's set up there, the pervasive DNA monitoring that they do, facial recognition. I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which you can essentially know where everyone is at any moment in time, with these technologies. And again, at a scale that was previously unimaginable, at an efficiency that was previously unimaginable. It's really kind of a scary thing to think about, a regime with as well resourced as the CCP to be able to do this to an entire group of people and get away with it. And finally, all of the folks on this slide are activists, people trying to fight for freedom in their home countries, Alexei Navalny, Joshua Wong. I'll just point out that, and they've all been targeted by the governments in those countries with some form of tech. I'll point out Jamal Khashoggi's case here because Jamal Khashoggi and the ways in which he was surveilled and targeted, reportedly by the NSO Group, which is an Israeli technology firm, and eventually led to him being brutally murdered in consulate in Turkey by Saudi agents. I think that these types of incidents make it very hard for people to do the work and trust that they're going to be okay at the end of the day. And that Khashoggi's killers and those responsible for giving the orders for the murder of Khashoggi, they've still not been brought to justice. And it's really this merger of authoritarianism with the technology that's the scariest part of this. And beyond the spyware that was put on, Khashoggi's phone by NSO Group, there's also a lot of discussion about building in other protocols in order to circumvent, encrypted chat applications and the other ways in which people do their communications. And that's got to be a scary thing, and something that we all need to kind of draw a line in the sand and say, we can't allow this to happen. So what does this mean for the future of human rights? And specifically, where does human rights first fit into this ecosystem that we're talking about? So I'll take a step back to say that I am the first chief technology officer at HRF. I joined the organization last year because I saw what was going on in terms of tech and in terms of where human rights organizations were going. And I said to myself, there's got to be a way to enable human rights defenders, organizations with technologies to be able to at least take on a level playing field the actors that we're going up against. And we're just about to do a public launch of our innovation lab, which we have been working to build over the last year and a half at HRF. In order to do that, to realize a world where human rights organizations and defenders that we work with have access to technologies and tools that are going to make it so that they're not always outmatched, outclassed by private tech companies and by the authoritarian regimes that they're often going up against. What does that look like? It looks like building tools to track and understand violent white extremist networks online. It looks like using data science to track police use of force around the US, specifically around the social justice protests that we saw happen over the summer. It means providing tools and apps so that human rights defenders can defend themselves from digital surveillance. And that's just a few of the things that we're working on. And I'll point to a couple of companies that are doing things that I think have implications for how technology can help human rights organizations and defenders and activists around the world. SpaceX, for example, they're building a system called Starlink. And Starlink potentially can enable human rights folks to get around internet blockades, say those that happened in Iran last year and in Belarus this year, to be this global broadband provider that doesn't require a ton of physical infrastructure on the ground and can reach across borders to provide that access to people. This has got to be something that we need to think about in terms of how private actors, kind of flip the paradigm on its head, can support the human rights field in their work, and also to potentially aid in humanitarian disasters where you don't have the time to set up kind of lay fiber and get broadband going in refugee camps, for example. Another, much smaller effort, and it's not endorsement or anything, but there's a company called Reflecticles. They have noted the rise of infrared-enabled facial recognition, and they've built, and you can buy these glasses. They have like sunglasses and other types of eyewear to prevent algorithms from being able to read your eyes and be able to scan your face. And they have one that has an infrared light that turns on and actually will basically illuminate your face at night so that your Ring doorbell can't automatically find where you are. And if you're thinking about this in the case of, say, Hong Kong and the activists there, the protesters that were working the last year, in order to protest the actions of the Hong Kong government, many of them were wearing goggles and masks in order to prevent this. Some of them were wearing those masks in order to prevent, inhaling tear gas. These are things that pieces of hardware that I think are examples of where we need to start thinking outside the box in order to level the playing field a little bit. I'll close on this note. There may be some room to think about whether or not the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which came to rise in the 40s, needs to evolve a little bit to acknowledge some of the trends that we've just talked about. If you look at Article 19, the way that it's written, it's arguable that there's a lot of freedoms already in there that people should observe when it comes to access to information and how that potentially could apply to a world where tech is so pervasive. But should we be thinking about this as do we have a right to our own personal data? Should that be enshrined in the UDHR? Do we have a right to be free from disinformation and the purveyors of disinformation? Do we have a right to be free from hate speech and the kinds of violent threats that people who work in our space often get while they're operating online? And is there a right to internet access? Could you imagine working now, doing your daily work, living your daily life without access to the internet? And the number of people around the world who now have access to it, how do we ensure that they do? And should this be something that's explicitly outlined, delineated in the UDHR? So that's, I think a ton of information that I just relayed. And as is in the Zoom world, I've actually just been talking to a screen this whole time. So I have no idea what the audience is thinking and whether everyone's gone to sleep by now or anything. So I'm going to pause here, and I think I'll turn it back over to Derek and Tim, for anything, and then potentially open it up to questions.
Sure. Hey, Welton, this is Tim DeRoche, Director of Programs for World Oregon. I'm going to jump straight in on questions. You're getting the disembodied voice. It kind of lends itself to the Orwellian voice of authority. Not that I really am, but hey, one of the things that occurs to me is with a shift in the administration, we're going to see a shift in leadership with the FCC. I mean, Ajit Pai has been quite controversial. Certainly, the big fears have been enabling deregulation, weakening civil liberties, creating imbalances for tech equity and access, and probably the most well-known was the net neutrality repeal. And I'm wondering if in the world that you operate, is there much hope for anything being pulled back, reformed, moved forward? And what are people's fears and hopes in this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. I think one of the greatest fears is that the current partisan environment is going to result in the passage of some kind of regulation. Passage of some kind of legislation or the writing of some kind of regulation that is the worst of both worlds. So in the case of net neutrality, I think it's a world where we lose the kind of our ability to get access to information that's not being directly mediated by the telecom companies, right? But then, I think the other big fear, and you talk about the FCC, is Section 230, and the implications of, some kind of repeal of Section 230, amendment to Section 230, carve out, further carve outs within Section 230 to further specify, what's allowable, not allowable, what things companies have, liability protection against. It's this unfortunate reality of, lack of cooperation by people who I think have similar goals in mind, looking at the current regulatory schemes and mechanisms saying this is not adequate. Like, we can't live in a world where this is the status quo, but then not being able to agree on the exact pathway to get to a solution, and then some, it's kind of like the Abilene paradox, where you wind up in Abilene, Texas, and everyone's looking at each other like, well, how did we get to Abilene, Texas? Nobody wanted to be in Abilene, but nobody, was able to corral enough support in order to push forward the proper set of, amendments, regulations, and we get for example, a Section 230 that crushes free expression on these platforms, but at the same time allows for hate speech to go even more rampant than it already is. That's the big fear, I think, where because we can't get folks to the same table and to talk about this in a reasonable manner, that we wind up with not very good outcomes at all. And yeah, that's the big fear, I think.
Well, so I posted in the chat for people who are listening in or watching an article that you just did with Duan Lee and Peter Singer on the toxic minefield of social media. And one of the things you talk about is that the only way that we really sort of clean up the hate speech and the disinformation is by tracking data at the same time that we empower users. And that's an interesting balance for me, because on the one hand, that sounds a little bit more like surveillance. And on the other hand, what does that mean for something like Parler, which has just started, which is not moderated and I think you can't even call it a public square. Perhaps it is. Maybe it's a very medieval public square. But what's the balance between the surveillance and agency to make sure that we're not having the problems that we're having?
I think one of the key things to keep in mind with any kind of, say, platform content moderation is, first and foremost, for those platforms to observe privacy where possible. So here's an example. Let's say I built a system on Twitter that every time the word pizza came up, and pizza was code word for something. I'm kind of getting into an edgy joke here, right? I would get flagged, or a system would flag the user that this word had come up. It's possible to build the system so that say the account name, the biographic details of that user are totally obscured, and that only after a manual review by, let's say 2 content moderators, you are allowed to see the true identity of that person and, be able to take action, right? How does this currently work? Well, there's no transparency at all, and we don't actually know how these moderation systems work, right? So let's say you posted something on Facebook or on Twitter and you got flagged for it, and later on you saw, hey, you've been suspended, right? Like, what's the current mechanism to find out, like, why did this happen to me? Like, basically there is none, and you just have to wait until they unsuspend your account. And you can try to use your connections to go to these companies and ask, like, why was it that I was suspended? They may or may not respond to you. So the second pillar of this, beyond the privacy controls that are built into the systems, is some kind of transparency, right? To be able to say, this is exactly how the system is operating. And for example, we are no longer going to allow hate speech on our platform. And here are all the things that we consider to be hate speech. Facebook has pretty detailed community standards when it comes to this kind of thing, but it's still unclear to me how exactly they're enforcing all of those things. And Twitter has kind of the flip side of it, where they just, they do a lot of bans left and right, but we don't really know explicitly, beyond what's in the very, very broad terms of service, like exactly what qualifies as, for example, hate speech, right? So I don't advocate for, like, let's say 5 people at Twitter to have some kind of God mode and be able to just ban people left and right. We certainly don't want that, especially with the power that these platforms have. And that's a separate conversation that's more about monopoly and more about the fact that these companies have become the de facto public square than it is about the content moderation policy specifically in place. I think part of the challenge is disaggregating those two things, the power of the platform to serve as a public good and the power of the platform to, say, regulate a form of, for example, not constitutionally protected speech, right? Violent hate speech, threatening speech. I'm going to kill you because you're an X group or X person, right? That's not something that should be allowable on the platform. Even, it's not something you can say to a person in real life. So there are some finer distinctions here that need to be drawn. And I think, this is a pretty deep debate. There's got to be controls put in place. It's not an easy thing to tackle, but we certainly don't think that it's something where, we should just give blanket ability for a group of people at a tech company to be able to say yes or no, this is allowable and this is not.
Well, and this is not even a new debate. I mean, the taffy pull between personal freedoms and public good has been, that's been the history of this country. So Karen's got a question here. In the US, what federal agencies would manage the privacy protections needed, and what civil society groups are leading any pushback? And who's leading this effort internationally, both the government and the civil society level?
Yeah, that's a great question, Karen. I will give a shout out to the good folks at the ACLU, at EFF, for Amnesty Tech, for leading the charge on this. I think that only recently, especially at our organization, but in the human rights field in general, have we really started to think about the intersection of how these types of regulations have become part and parcel, similar to the human rights work that we do, and how essential this is to the broader umbrella of human rights. Federal agencies, yeah, certainly there's some FCC involvement, there's some FTC involvement. There's I think there's some discussion about some of the other agencies playing a role here, but in many ways, this is a realm that is really the provenance of Congress. And because of the way that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act limits any form of liability for the company, so then you can't necessarily take them to task for something that they failed to do, and that led to harm later on down the line, right? So an example here would be the Christchurch shooter using Facebook Live to propagate video of his murderous shooting spree. And let's say there were people who were psychologically harmed by this. Like there's no way right now for someone to say like, hey, I'm going to go to Facebook and hold them to account for this. There's no government actor that can do that. You can hold a hearing, right? And in many ways, these hearings are a little bit toothless because of Section 230 and the way that it's broadly written, and why so many people on the left and the right agree that Section 230 needs to be changed. The challenge is that they don't agree on what those changes should be and what are the ultimate outcomes that are desirable for those changes.
So here's an interesting question about behavior. And I'm trying to make sense of it a little bit. What about the right to be free of a label denoting behavioral dysfunction because of heavy use tech tools? For example, tech addiction. So the current DSM-5 of psychiatric disorders does not identify heavy use of technology as an addictive disorder at this time, although there isn't probably a person involved in this program today that doesn't doom scroll. But there is a whole business enterprise area that has been developed over the curing of supposed tech addiction. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, hi, Anna. I'm not an expert on this, and I'm not going to pretend to be. I'm not a clinician, and I went to school with a lot of clinicians, so perhaps we should ask them what their opinion is. I would just say that I think that there's got to be a conversation about what is a healthy amount of use of technology for everybody, not just people who have been labeled this. I think yesterday I had 8 Zoom calls in a row. So certainly the pandemic has made an even bigger impact on this. But there's a world in which we're living where essentially we'll always have some kind of digital medium in front of us, and I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but something that bears discussion, debate.
Oh, we've got a good question here about activism, digital activism, whistleblowers. What have you seen around protecting tech activists within big tech companies? Because it seems that existing whistleblower protections are not enough, and labor and online harassment is very common, leading many tech activists to either quit or get laid off from these companies. Or what kind of emergent protections need to happen beyond existing whistleblower ones?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not something I've spent a lot of time, working on. I am familiar with the NLRB ruling recently, the National Labor Relations Board, about the 2 engineers at Google who were unjustly fired by Google. This is huge because of the amount of power that the tech companies have, right? And how did we find out about what was going on at Twitter, say, when Saudi regime actors were improperly accessing the biographic data and the Twitter data of Saudi activists on the platform? I mean, how do we learn about what's going on at Facebook, right? And the kind of broken promises that the companies have, that are littering like the landscape right now. It's through these folks standing up and being able to say, like, I observed this, and this is not what I stand for. I think one thing that we aim to do at Human Rights First with our innovation lab is to provide a platform for talented technologists to be able to build tools and work on tech solutions that specifically are going to, help support, defend, and expand, the recognition of human rights. And we do so in a transparent way. We're going to do so open source, right? The technology that we build is going to be accessible by the entire community. Any data that we use is going to be, able to be accessed by people so they can replicate the research that we do. I think this is a huge piece of this, and perhaps there needs to be a deeper tie-in between, say, government whistleblowers and organizations like Whistleblower Aid with the tech organizations, tech companies that have people who are like, hey, I saw this thing happen at this company and like Clearview AI, and I really need to be able to tell somebody about what's going on here. And to have the legal support, potentially something similar to the SEC reward system, to be able to compensate them for the amount of risk that they're taking, and also to incentivize people coming forward for actual wrongdoing that they observe.
I'm going to end with one last question, and it brings to mind Dr. Pangloss from Voltaire's Candide, who always talks about the best of all possible worlds. Yeah. This question comes from our social media intern, who is working with World Oregon while living in Norway and attending virtual school in Shanghai. And these are the things that are only possible through the beauty and the marvel of technology. And her question is, recently some politicians in the US have advocated for government to, quote, break up big tech. What does this mean in the context of government and tech company relationships? And how would this affect issues with regard to surveillance, content regulation, and human rights, in your opinion?
Wow, that's a huge question. And I have 3 minutes left to try to give some semblance of a coherent.
6 if you want.
Awesome. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there's a lot wrapped up in the debate around tech monopoly. I will start off by saying I do think that there are, significant kind of political motivations for doing so that go beyond the actual harms from, lack of competition in, say, for example, the search space, right? So again, I alluded to this earlier on in the discussion, kind of disaggregating the tech power issue at the company level from some of the potential harms that are coming on down the line from things, say, like disinformation, right? So the problems with Google's recommendation engine as being separate from the problems of everybody having to use Google, and them squashing, any other competitors in the space. Although I will personally say that I use DuckDuckGo for all my searches. I think the first thing to take away from it is that the world in which we lived, where we all thought that tech was just going to be this unalloyed good for our lives and for the people, is one of the distant past. I think that there's like a much more public recognition, greater recognition, even in pop culture around, things like Black Mirror, that show that there are so many, different ways in which a lot of this stuff can get really out of hand. And so, in a world where the tech companies say don't have to adhere to any kind of, legal beckon from the government, a lot of the compliance that they're doing is as a result of goodwill, and it relies on, say, a good relationship between, say, an Apple and the Department of Justice in order to get, some information that the Department of Justice needs for a legitimate investigation. It relies on a relationship between Facebook and, say, the FBI to report child predators that they observe on their platform and report threatening, language or, violent things that get posted. So there is a level of cooperation that exists there that I think, if were to be eliminated as a result of, just a general kind of degradation of the relationship there could be some actual, issues that we would face that we didn't initially intend to set out to have in front of us. I do think that, like, it's weird that the government is wielding the monopoly stick in order to take it to some of the companies around content moderation. It feels like the wrong punishment for an issue that most of us agree, like, the companies should be doing more about. Well, I don't see how breaking up Facebook is going to make it easier to stop hate speech from popping up on the platform. That doesn't seem to me to be, the right solution to the problem at hand. That's not to say that Facebook isn't a monopoly in some ways, but it is to say that there's some incongruity between the solution and the problem in that case. So, I hope that that's at least a little bit informative, explanatory. And, again, I want to thank Derek, Tim, and Skip for hosting me today. Thank you, World Oregon and Tech Oregon, for having me. And I had a great time.
Thanks a lot, Welton.
Thank you, Welton. Thank you, Tim, for moderating, and audience, thanks for the fantastic questions. We could have gone on for more, but I would encourage you again to take a look at some of his writing he's done. Tim has posted in chat the article he did with Peter Singer, as well as he posted a link to Peter Singer's 2015 International Speaker Series talk. I would note that Peter Singer has a brand new novel out that I actually put on my Christmas wish list because it looks fascinating. His last one was quite
Ghost Fleet was the last one,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah. So I encourage you, if you like sort of the blend of futurism and fiction, to look at that. And take a look at the Human Rights First website. It's also posted in the chat. They've got a lot of information about the work of that nonprofit and their partnership with some of the others that are working on these issues. Welton, thank you again for your time and your expertise. Encourage you to join us next Tuesday. We have a great program coming up with Bonnie Glick, who is until very recently the Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. She's a former Foreign Service officer, also worked at Meridian International Center. I was going to talk about Caring for the World, the future of U.S. foreign assistance, really very fresh from her experience in USAID. That is Tuesday, December 8th at noon. So if you are not already a member of Tech Association or World Oregon, I encourage you to join up. Also remember that we're encouraging people to think about end-of-year donations for us and other nonprofits. If you have the ability to do so, it helps us in this challenging times. Welton, thanks again for all your expertise. Look forward to working with you and your colleagues in the future, and just really appreciate you sharing with our audience today.
Thank you, Derek. And again, thanks, Tim, for moderating, and thanks, audience, for participating through the Zoom.
Thanks, everyone, and big shout out to TAO for partnering with us on this. Have a good day.